So we've talked about microscopes, talked about cells, cell organelles. To finish up with this unit, we're going to be talking about cell processes. These are things that happen in cells. We're going to start by talking about osmosis and diffusion, and then we're going to move on and talk about photosynthesis and respiration. So to start, though, to talk about diffusion or osmosis, we first have to talk a little bit about concentrations and dissolving things. So probably you've all made Kool-Aid or drank Kool-Aid before. And if you make Kool-Aid and we make two different glasses of it, obviously those are quite different. Which one would have a higher concentration of Kool-Aid? Grady?
Cup B.
Cup B. Which would have a higher concentration of water? Amount? Cup A. Even though they're about the same amounts, A would have a higher concentration of water because it has less other stuff dissolved in it, less of the Kool-Aid. And so obviously B would taste stronger because it has a higher concentration of Kool-Aid. B and A would taste weaker because it has a higher concentration of water. Now if we're to sort of draw what this might look like inside using X's to represent the Kool-Aid powder molecules, B would have a higher concentration of those molecules than A would. So could you change the concentration of A to make it more like B? Yes. By doing what? Adding some of the Kool-Aid powder. How could you change B to be like A?
Yes.
Yes. You could dilute it. You could add more water to it, increasing the concentration of water until it matched the other one. So Kool-Aid is a solution. Salt water is a solution. Sugar water is a solution. The solution is when you take a substance, which we call the solute, the thing that gets dissolved, you add it to another substance, usually a liquid. We're always going to be talking about solids, dissolved, and liquids. And the solvent breaks down that larger solute into individual molecules where it seemingly disappears, but it's actually still present with the properties of the original molecule. So a solution is made of the solute and the solvent. So if we're thinking about Kool-Aid, what's the solute? Dean?
Kool-Aid powder.
The Kool-Aid powder. And the solvent? Great.
The water.
The water. For our purposes, we're always going to be talking about water as a solvent. But you could have other solvents as well. But we're usually going to be talking about water. So some simple examples here. We have some sugar water. Grace, what's the solute? Sugar. And the solvent? Water. Which has a higher concentration of sugar? Jake?
Sample B.
Sample B. Which has a higher concentration of water, Jake?
A.
A. Here we have some salt molecules making salt water. Olivia, what's the solute in salt water?
The salt.
The salt. And the solvent?
Water.
Water. Katie, which has a higher concentration of salt molecules?
Sample A.
Sample A. And a higher concentration of water, Katie? Sample. Okay, let's look at a little bit of a different example. Now we're talking about sugar water again. These are glucose molecules. In this example, Francesca, what's the solute?
The glucose
The
molecule.
glucose molecules. And the solvent?
Oh, the water.
The water. Which is a higher concentration of glucose? Brian?
The 50 milliliters.
What's that?
The 50 milliliters of water.
Sample B? but there's 6 molecules of glucose, right, in each of them, right? So why does B have a higher concentration?
There's less water.
Yes, because there's less water. So even though they're the same amount of glucose, B has a higher concentration of glucose because there's less water. Think of concentrations as a percentage. You know, whereas this might be 10% glucose, this would be 20%. Okay, so as we talk about all of this, concentration and solutions, it becomes important as we think about cells, because if you remember back when we talked about the cell membrane. Cell membrane is a thin layer separating a cell from its outside, and it is what controls the movement of molecules into and out of the cell. The cell membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. It's a double layer. And sort of stuck throughout it are various types of proteins that have different jobs to do. And certain molecules can pass through this membrane, other molecules cannot. We'll be talking about that. But some words that we use. The cell membrane is permeable to oxygen. What do you think that means, the word then, permeable? Permeable to oxygen. Emma? Yeah, the oxygen can basically pass freely through the cell membrane. The membrane is permeable to oxygen. The cell membrane is impermeable to starch. What does impermeable mean? Dean?
Substances can't freely pass.
Right, they cannot pass through. So the term we have for the cell membrane, and basically all membranes, is that they are semi-permeable, meaning that some molecules are allowed to pass through, but other molecules are not.
How does the cell membrane have a little bit more?
Well, we'll talk about that in 1 second, because what types of molecules do you think can easily pass through the cell membrane? Dean?
Water.
Yeah? Well, why water? Oxygen can? Carbon dioxide can? Why those molecules? And why not starch or some other substance? Joe?
Because they're less heavy.
You're on the right track. It's the size of the molecules important. Small molecules like oxygen, water, carbon dioxide can sort of squeeze through this phospholipid bilayer and pass freely through it. Larger molecules, however, cannot just pass through it. Those larger molecules often need special proteins that are sort of stuck within the cell membrane. Some almost act as a tunnel, allowing larger molecules to get through. They are specific, whereas they might let glucose through, but not another similar molecule. So the way that these proteins are structured is what determines which can get in and out. And so that's sort of how the cell knows what can pass through because of these proteins. Okay, let's think back at our Kool-Aid one more time. So when we talk about concentration, it's a word we use to talk about the strength of a solution. We think about these 5 glasses of Kool-Aid. Describe the concentration of Kool-Aid and water of this glass. Grace?
It's a high concentration of water and a low concentration of fluid.
Correct. It has a low concentration of Kool-Aid and a high concentration of water. Describe the opposite glass of Kool-Aid. Grady?
It has a high concentration of Kool-Aid and a low concentration of water.
Correct. Even though they're all the same amount of water, I adding more Kool-Aid, we're increasing the concentration of Kool-Aid, we're decreasing the concentration of water. Again, you could think of this as percentages. This might be 1% Kool-Aid and 99% water. And this one might be 5% Kool-Aid, 95% water. So it has a higher concentration of Kool-Aid, a lower concentration of water. All right, so this leads us to a definition of diffusion. So diffusion is about molecules moving. And a molecule is just sort of the building block of matter. A molecule is basically the smallest piece of a compound you can have. The smallest amount of salt you can have is a single molecule of salt. If you were to break that single salt molecule down further, it would no longer be salt. It would be something different. Okay? The smallest amount of glucose you can have is a single molecule of glucose. It still has all the properties of glucose, but it's the smallest amount you can possibly have. And so molecules follow certain natural laws, and one of those is diffusion. Molecules will move from an area where they are highly concentrated to an area where there's a lower concentration. Doesn't require any energy. Molecules just sort of do this on their own. They move from areas of high to low concentration. Sometimes say it, molecules do not like to be crowded. One analogy you sometimes make is if you think of the molecules as 7th graders. I could probably take every 7th grade student in our school and pack them into this classroom. Right? It'd be probably smelly and gross and hot and crowded, but you would all probably fit in there. That would obviously be a very high concentration of 7th graders. So let's say I did that, forced all 7th graders into this room, closed all the doors. But then I open up the door in the back of the room. What would you guys do probably? Everybody would go over there?
Some will like spread out.
Yes, not everybody would go there because you'd be just as crowded, right? Probably about half of the students would go over there, and then you'd all have a little bit more space. If I then open up the door into Miss Canale's room, what would happen? Yeah, you'd spread out again. You wouldn't need somebody saying, okay, guys, go over in there and go in this room. You just do that sort of on your own. Right? That's sort of like molecules. Molecules are in a tight, highly concentrated area. They will naturally just spread out to areas of lower concentration. For example, this morning I walked into this classroom, I opened it up, and when I opened it up, I noticed Mr. Arcuri was back in that corner. The door was open. He had told me last night that he had chili for dinner. And so I came into this classroom, and he quickly walked back into his classroom and closed the door. But as soon as I came in, all of a sudden this stench started to overcome me. And what had happened is the molecules that Mr. Arcuri had released in the corner of the room started off at a very high concentration, probably a deadly concentration. But over time, those molecules then spread out into less concentrated area throughout the room, and that's why I could smell that odor as soon as I came in this classroom. The molecules had diffused throughout the classroom. If you put a drop of dye in a beaker of water, it starts off as a little droplet, a high concentration of those dye molecules. But over a few minutes, they will diffuse and spread throughout the water. So molecules do this because they're randomly moving and they just randomly sort of bump into each other and then spread out. That's what diffusion is. So our definition of diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The other concept, and actually we're going to talk more about osmosis than we are diffusion. Osmosis is just one special case of diffusion. We call it osmosis when it's water that is moving from an area of high to low concentration through a membrane. So the diffusion of water across a membrane is called osmosis. So it's important to remember, molecules will always move from high to low concentration. So let's imagine this experimental setup. We actually have this. It doesn't work that well sometimes. It leaks all the time. But this is a U-shaped hollow plastic tube. Comes in two sections. And you could actually put a membrane, a little piece of plastic, between these two sections. So there's this semi-permeable membrane between them. And then let's say that I had salt water. Purple molecules represent salt molecules. And I had two different concentrations. Okay. And I put one type of solution on this side and another on this side. So first of all, where is there a higher concentration of salt in this example? Taylor? On the right. And so we have a lower concentration of salt on the left. So what, based on what we know about diffusion, which way would the salt molecules move? Grace?
To the left.
From the right to the left. However, let's say that this membrane is impermeable to salt. So maybe they would move there, but they're not allowed to. They can't get through the membrane, so they're stuck where they were. So the salt molecules cannot diffuse. Okay, now let's think about osmosis. Where is there a higher concentration of water? Francesca?
On the left.
On the left. Obviously, then there's a lower concentration of water on the right. So which way would the water molecules move? To the right. From the left to the right. Well, let's say the membrane is permeable to water. What would we expect this to look like after a few minutes? Come on?
The water from the left side will go on the right side, and the salt would stay.
Yeah, the salt stays, but the water levels would change. Because water is going to move to the right due to osmosis, the water level on the right would increase, water level on the left would decrease. Okay. This is an example of osmosis. Water's moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. One more example, and your slide looks a little different, so you're going to have to be careful here in how you record this. Okay. You have A, B, and C, right? Here's our A, B, and C. Okay, let's imagine some cells. Obviously, they're enlarged. They're not as big as a beaker. What type of cells do these represent? Do you know? What cell looks like that? Dean?
So you have red blood cell.
Yeah, that's a red blood cell. They're all red blood cells. Yep. So these are red blood cells. Simple cells. They don't have a whole lot of organelles in them. And cells within our body are made mostly of what? Mostly water. Depends on the type of cell. Let's call it 95% water. Cells, 95% water, 5% other stuff. Okay. So if I take red blood cells that are 95% water, and I place them in a salt solution that's 5% salt, 95% water, what do you think would happen to them? Dean?
Shrink.
No? So the cell's 95% water, the solution is 95% water. Am I? No? Grace?
Would they get bigger because they're soaking up more water?
Nope.
Nothing will change.
It would stay the same. They're in a balanced solution. So there's 95% water in the cell, 95% water outside of the cell, so there's no net movement of water either way. Some water would go in, some water would come out, but it would be about equal. And so the cells would stay about the same. So on your slide, write A, equal concentration. That's what this is showing. Now what's happened to those red blood cells when we look at this next beaker? On yours it's labeled B. What's happened to the cells? Yeah? Alex?
They sort of split apart.
Not quite split apart. Mom? They shrink. Why would they shrink? What do you think this solution is like that they were placed in? Again, cells 95% water. What could I place them in that would cause them to shrink? Dean?
95% salt, 5% water.
Okay. Yeah, that would be like an extreme version. But any solution that has what? A lower concentration of what? Of water. Maybe it's 10% salt, 90% water. If that were the case, the cells have 95% water. The solution I place them in have 90% water. So which direction is the water going to go? Grace? Out of the cell, into that solution. So that would have a lower concentration of water than the cell. And that causes the cells to shrivel up. They lose water, they shrivel. What about the last beaker? First, what appears to have happened to these red blood cells? Joey? They grew. What solution could they have been placed in that would cause them to grow? Brady?
More than 95% water.
Yeah, if they were placed in just pure water, 100% water, again, now we switch the concentration. Water would go from 100% water into those cells, which are 95% water, causing them to swell up. Could even cause them to burst. Okay. It has a higher concentration of water. If a person, say, is running the Boilermaker, gets dehydrated, passes out, they bring them to the medical tent, how do they treat them? Person that's dehydrated. Brian? They give them an IV to get more fluids into their body. Do they put pure water in their IV? No, because if they did, they would be in this situation. And pure water directly into the circulatory system is bad, because water would then flow into red blood cells, causing them to swell up and even burst. What do they give a person? They don't give them just water. Don't they give them, Francesca?
Like saline?
They give them a saline solution. If cells are 95% water, what do you think the saline solution is? Also 95% water. So it gets extra fluid into the body without the net movement of water into or out of the red blood cells.
What were we supposed to write for our A?
Equal concentration of water. Okay. So we're going to be demonstrating this process of osmosis in a few different ways. And that's why we started the eggs yesterday. It's what we're going to do with the carrots and some other things, okay? All right, so you can put your notes away.